This is Miller Philosopher. If you watch my videos, you know that I have defended the portrayal of Arwen in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And, most recently, by making the comparison of Arwen's relationship to her father, Elrond, with that of Luthien's father, Thingol. So today I'm going to go more in depth into that here, and it does go much further than just the both of them and Aragorn as well, being descended from the ancient half-elven, half-divine princess of a distant age. Starting with the OGs, of course. Luthien was born during the Great Sunless Peace of Beleriand before the start of the wars with Morgoth and the arrival of the Noldor. She was sheltered at that time, under the magical barrier of the Girdle of Melian when the war started, and grew up isolated from both the momentary peace and constant chaos of the outside world when the wars did get started. Her relationship with her father therefore comes off as something of your stereotypical princess daddy's girl trope. For all intents and purposes, she was away from the politics that went on, and this all changes, of course, when she meets Beren. We all know that particular story, so I'm not going to go into the details here, except to say that the night she met Beren is the night that Luthien's naivety of the world died and when her relationship to her father begins its change. I don't know if their relationship during their time in the forest after they met was sexual or not, but it is fair to say that Beren told her of what had been going on in the outside world at the very least, and as far as his people knew, what was left of them anyway. And it was her love for him that allowed any empathy for the outside world to enter her heart. Or, in other words, Luthien simply would not have cared if the news about what the wars and the suffering that was going on in the outside world had come from anybody else. She just would have ignored it and kind of gone on with her happy life. Beren marks the point where the already long-lived woman begins her maturity. And this is why I think Thingol is so pissed at Beren when they finally do meet. I definitely think that even the possibility of him having sexual relations with her heavily factored into Thingol's malice towards the human. And yes, it was malice. However, more than that, I think it was what his presence meant for Luthien. Despite the girdle still being there, his beloved daughter was now exposed and vulnerable to the changes of the world, and has now begun her slow change, as is shown when Luthien makes Thingol promise not to kill Beren before meeting him. It showed a mistrust that had formed that was not there before. However, some of this is also, I think, fatherly reaction to your daughter's first boyfriend, basically. And how she kept looking at Beren and even speaking for him when the man couldn't speak for himself, which probably infuriated Thingol. Yeah, why was his daughter defending him, basically? So, when Thingol tricks Beren into taking on the suicide mission of retrieving a Cimmeril, Luthien knew what was up, as did her mother, thus forming the second rift/change in their relationship. Her father now was trying to kill someone she had come to care for, regardless of any innocence or righteousness of cause. Thingol also picks up on Luthien's anger at him and therefore imprisons her in, I guess you can say, a heavily guarded treehouse. So now there's bad blood between the two. Neither trusts the other because of the entrance of a mortal into their status quo. And by the time Luthien sees her father again long afterwards, and when the quest is fulfilled, Thingol seems to have had a change of heart, perhaps realizing just how much of a malicious asshole he's been being. And Luthien also perhaps realizing that even though she loved Beren as her partner, that there was still love between her and her father, after all, no matter what other circumstances might change. She's much more mature now than she was during the infamous meeting of the two men in her life, and this leads to a reconciliation between the two, both recognizing in the other that a change had now come, but still loving each other despite that change. But this wasn't the end of Luthien's maturity, because Thingol and Melian undergo the ultimate nightmare of a parent, having lost a child, when Luthien willfully dies of grief later on after Beren passes on after a poisonous wound. We all know what happens next, but suffice it to say, this would have been the ultimate separation of parent and child in the real world. The story would have ended there. But this is Middle-earth, and normal only goes so far. The couple is resurrected miraculously, and again, we know the story, so I'm not going to go into that. And Thingol can scarcely believe it. But this miracle comes at a cost, and one worse than her death. His daughter, born of immortals, and older than any mortal human in Middle-earth, and having known the long peace of Beleriand long before Morgoth had come, is now also mortal herself. She is now going to die. I honestly imagine that this would look like her elven ears disappearing to represent this change, if it was going to be made into a movie or something like that. But, as far as I can tell in the book, The Silmarillion, this change is read in her eyes, and I imagine her presence of spirit. And while I think Melian most bears the brunt of this loss, now coming to fully understand the mortality of the world and what it means and what it brings, Thingol and Luthien also, I think, come to a recognition that whatever grace was shown by Uru is now irrevocably separated. Not just physically as shown when she and Beren depart, but now also spiritually, which to an immortal is much, much, much more profound, and something that mortals will never understand. And it's this particular dynamic that is at play when we see the trilogy's portrayal of Arwen and Elrond's relationship. Obviously, in the books, not much is said of Arwen, and if anything, what is said, even within the appendices, comes across as a much more formal relationship than their ancestors, even with her relationship with Aragorn. I can almost see it as, by outward appearance, appearing cold and distant, even though if I actually knew those people, I would be able to tell the emotion and warmth between them. That being said, there's more at play here as well, with all players not only being descended from Luthien and Beren, but also being well aware of the similarities and implications as well. Hell, Elrond is not that far off from Luthien according to the bloodline, even though he never met her. This also might explain why we don't see anyone freaking out over the relationship with Aragorn, with the exception of Aragorn himself perhaps when he first meets her. In fact, if anything, Arwen is even more hesitant about the relationship than her ancestor was with Beren, and probably for that very reason, because she knows what happened with that. You see, Luthien had left a legacy that others felt the weight of after her final passing, such as Elwing, Arundel's wife, making the choice of her and her husband to remain immortal because of what happened with her grandmother. This is something I never quite fully understood, but perhaps this was because so that the elves could have some part of Luthien remaining within the circles of the world, since her second death was regarded as such a heavy loss to many of them. And again, to be honest, I don't get that because, let's face it, not a lot of elves actually saw her, so I don't know, whatever. Anyways, that's the book relationship of Arwen and Elrond, but the movie relationship is much more like Luthien and Thingol's. Arwen is in love with Aragorn. Elrond is aware of this and clearly does not approve, but doesn't exactly try to stop it either. He disapproves for the same reasons that Thingol, for his part, hated Beren. Mortals and immortals cannot have relationships. In the Two Towers, after Arwen makes a prayer for Aragorn, she is finally confronted by her father, telling her that they're leaving Rivendell and Middle-earth and that she's expected to leave with them. Arwen gives the stereotypical "Daddy, I love him" response, but in a much more, obviously, classier fashion, of course. So we see here how this portrayal more so mirrors the Silmarillion tale than the book version that is mentioned in the appendices of Return of the King. However, despite that, Beren and Luthien are still part of the adaptation. So therefore it's easy to assume that there's an awareness of history is repeating itself, such as Aragorn singing Luthien's very song in Fellowship of the Ring. And also too, that this knowledge would also impact how Elrond and Arwen handle their relationship. Because without a doubt, both of them would be familiar with this story of their ancestors, and probably would make certain changes, I imagine. Elrond, for his part, no longer acts like Thingol from this point on because he bears no malice towards Aragorn, and that his concern is purely of an immortal father afraid of losing his immortal daughter, which again they feel much more heavily than mortals do. Nor does he take the drastic measures that his ancestor did by imprisoning his daughter like Thingol did. Instead, he just drops truth bombs on her, which worked far better than Thingol's method, quite frankly, laying out the cost of forsaking immortality and what that means to an immortal who has lived it. I'm guessing this is something that all elves fear, judging by the way Arwen's reaction was when she actually foresaw this through her foresight. And you know that's kind of got to suck for her because she's getting these truth bombs getting nuked on her, on top of the foresight coming on top of that, reinforcing the blows. However, the final kicker being that Elrond asks after all this if Arwen still loves him as well. This might seem like a dick move from Elrond, making Arwen choose between her lover and her father, but I don't think it is. I think it's Elrond knowing the story of his ancestors, learning from Thingol's mistakes as a father, and rather than try and force the decision as Thingol did, just simply lays out the blueprint of, hey, this is what's going to happen if you follow through with this. And what this effectively does is that it lays bare both Arwen's real reason for wanting to stay in Middle-earth despite all her previous claims of wanting to stay for the people, and also, too, the fear of the elves, the fear of mortality, I guess you can say. So, perhaps if Thingol, or better yet Melian, had taken this approach with Luthien instead of sticking her in a giant treehouse, Luthien's choices would have been much more different than canon was. And, as a side note, this also reveals the selfishness, if you will, of both movie Arwen and book Luthien, if you want to be honest. You see, as I just mentioned, movie Arwen often boasts about her choice to stay in Middle-earth being for the hope for all its people, and to the hope to defeat Sauron. And Luthien is mostly remembered for being the ancestor of the Númenórean and Dúnedain rulers that follow her bloodline much later on after she's passed. But the fact of the matter was that in that moment for both women, they weren't thinking about such lofty ideals. They were thinking about how much they loved their partners. Okay, so that if you look at it that way, it kind of, I want to say takes away the shine, but it does demythologize it a little bit, I think. And, well, yes, Arwen at least does have her moment to rise above that because she has her second vision in Return of the King of her son. It still doesn't change the fact that her initial motivation was self-centered in a way. That she loved Aragorn only as much as she could still hold on to her immortality. And that it was going to cost her that scared her very much. If anything, I think the second vision proves that it would take more than the love of a mortal, no matter how great, to cause her to forsake that very immortality and endure the cost that it brings, to take on such a burden for something that was immeasurably as valuable as immortality itself. And this is something that, honestly, even the Númenóreans did understand about it, because the reason for which such to pay a price had to be higher, even higher than being in love, basically. And Luthien, as far as we know, never has this kind of revelation. For her, it basically wasn't really needed. She loved Beren, she would have done anything for him, and she does. End of story. I'm not saying that this selfishness was like evil, like Sauron or Fëanor, arguably, or Morgoth per se, but at the same time, it was out of self-interest. It wasn't for a higher ideal or goal, as others later on made it out to be. But regardless of that, this is why I think the relationships between Arwen and Elrond and Luthien and Thingol parallel each other. So, having said that, which one do you think is better? Or do you disagree with this thought regardless? Let me know in the comments below. But this is the Miller Philosopher. Y'all have a good day.